So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's seminar, Alzheimer's Disease and Research Updates. And my name is Fumiko Suzuki, and coordinator at Japanese Social Services. So this e-learning session is co-provided by Momiji Healthcare Society and Japanese Social Services, and joined by Ihon Center and Kcwa Family and Social Services. So before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. So housekeeping rules. So this session is recorded, but a Q&A session and your face and voice will not be recorded. So please refrain from recording or taking photo of this session. And during the session, you are muted. So please stay muted until the Q&A time comes. And please keep your note for any comments or any question during the presentation. And at the Q&A session, please raise your hand for your comment or any question. So you can unmute yourself when your name is called. And the question received via chat will be taken at the Q&A time. And it is up to you to have your video on, so showing your face, but it is very good for individual psychological well-being to see other faces. So we encourage you to turn on the video. And if you decided to turn off in video, host will indicate when you can unmute yourself during the Q&A session. Okay, and we would like to introduce hosting organization of today's seminar. So, Chie-san.
Hi everyone, Happy New Year. Hope your holiday season was good despite all those Omicron things. So my name is Chie. I am a client intervention worker at the Momiji Healthcare Society. We are a nonprofit supportive housing servicing in English and Japanese, located in Scarborough, Toronto, serving seniors and caregivers. We right now have virtual programs, educational sessions, falls prevention, seated exercises, and museum tours, and so on. So please contact us for more information, and if you'd like to join, you can pre-register. And also we are doing Toriichi Bento fundraising right now. So if you are interested in getting a Japanese bento box made by Toriichi, so we're selling it for $15 per bento, and that's a fundraising for us. And then you have to actually come to pick it up. But if that's okay, you can pick it up on January 26 and order by January 21 noon. So let us know if you're interested. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Chie-san. And now I would like to introduce Japanese Social Services. So Japanese Social Services is a non-profit agency that provides counseling and programs in both English and Japanese. So we are located in the second floor of Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, but currently providing service remotely. So you can reach us by phone or email. And we also, every month, we are hosting e-learning seminar on second and fourth Wednesday and posting details on our website. So if you are interested, please check our website, jss.ca. Okay, so next is Ihon Center.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mabel, and I'm very happy to be here. And my colleague Angela is also here. So we are from Ihon Center for Geriatric Care, established in 1994. Ihon Center is a non-profit organization providing community support services, home support services, and currently 4 long-term care homes and a hospice to the community. Currently, we are providing most of our programs and services remotely, virtual programs, virtual day programs, virtual webinars, as well as support groups. So if you would like to get more information, please give us a call or check out our website. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And next is Kcwa Family and Social Services.
Hello everyone, Happy New Year. Hope you guys had a wonderful holiday season with your loved ones. My name is Momiji Park and I'm the manager of Kcwa Family and Social Services. This might be first time for you hearing about our agency. Our agency is also a nonprofit organization established in 1985 by a group of women who are concerned for family and women issues. However, we do not serve all services only to women and their dependents, but we serve all women, men, seniors, and youth. We provide settlement services, which is related to immigration issues, education, health, and all different areas that immigrants may need to better integrate into Canadian society. And we also provide free family counseling services, counseling for youth, couples, and also adults for those who require emotional support. However, our services are only provided in English and Korean. So when you get a chance, it would be wonderful if you could visit our agency and get to know more about us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, so next is Mabel. Take it away.
Yes, today we are very happy to have our wonderful guest speaker to come and talk to us about Alzheimer's disease and research updates. It's my honor to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Wai-Hung Yu. Dr. Yu is an independent scientist with the Brain Health Imaging Center and the Adult Neurodevelopment and Geriatric Psychiatric Division at Cambridge. He is also an assistant professor in the Department of Pharmacological and Toxicological at the University of Toronto, with full School of Graduate Studies member. And his research areas include mechanisms of the pathologies in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, and the transitional development. So we are very happy to have Dr. Yu today with us and talks about the Alzheimer's disease and research updates. And let's welcome Dr. Yu.
So thank you, Mabel, and everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to give a talk about, and I'm going to start with a bit of brain health. This is something very near to my heart, especially in terms of some of the audiences growing up. One of the things I think that's important as a person of Asian descent was kind of understanding some of the community impact on health and health literacy of people of Asian descent, which often kind of lags other populations on that, but not necessarily gets that same level of kind of appreciation of the disparity. So some of the research that I do started off as much more basic science, kind of thinking about how cells and animals can be used as models for Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. But with this study, it's an opportunity to actually go into the community, do some of the work that I've done in terms of outreach and education on brain health that I did as a volunteer effort, and start to think about how Alzheimer's disease might impact populations, specifically, in this case, East Asians as the initial study, but we do hope to kind of branch out onto this. So I'm going to start with the slides. Just bear with me. Hopefully, can everyone see my slides? Great. Okay, so the talk is a little bit longer. It's brain health, Alzheimer's disease risk in Asians, and the cohort for Asian disease studies, or Asian cohort for Alzheimer's disease study, or ACAD, on this. And I think it's really important, you know, that while everyone has a brain, we know that it how it gets impacted through your lived experiences, as well as potentially different ethnic variations might impact how your brain health functions, as well as how it might decline in diseases like Alzheimer's disease. So what I want to do is kind of go through some of those aspects and kind of give you a little point of you know, how things might change as one ages, and things to kind of think about to kind of promote the healthy brain. So the changes in the brain do occur with aging. It's not unnatural. These types of things, like the body, the brain can also age. Sometimes you have decline in activity. Sometimes there are parts of your brain that shrink or lose activity. This can be natural, but diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are considered a disease state because these are not among the natural aging processes. And so while it is okay to have some memory loss, in diseases like Alzheimer's disease, you do have more profound effects that go on. And we can actually take a look at this within the brain. This is magnetic resonance imaging of a brain from someone who's 25 years old and someone who's 75 years old. And you can see a few differences that take place on that. For one, here is actually what the brain looks like, and it's encased in your skull. And this is actually what the brain looks like in a 75-year-old with Alzheimer's disease. And two important things to kind of notice. You'll see that these areas seem to have some loss, because this is the brain and this is actually just fluid. And so that's actually important when you have neuronal loss or brain cell loss in here. And then this white area is actually called part of an event called inflammation. So similar to your body, when you start to get inflammation, your joints start to get stiff and things like that. This is an accelerated case where these areas become inflamed with brain cells that are involved with inflammation response. And this can be actually quite detrimental to the brain function. And when we think about the brain, we have different parts that kind of govern different areas of the brain. And what we're thinking about in terms of memory loss is this area here and this area here, which is really involved with kind of problem solving and concentration in some of these, what we call the temporal cortex. And then, and then this area is also deeper layers. You'll have an area that's involved with learning and memory. And I'm going to just transition over to, while we think about brain health, we can't ignore the fact that the brain is part of the body, and that body encompasses things like the heart's blood and lungs. And so the lungs are really responsible for delivering oxygen by the blood through the heart to the brain. And it delivers also blood to other organs. But what's unique about the brain is it's only 2% of your body weight. So if you're 100 pounds, the brain is about it's probably like, a much smaller amount of it, but it uses 25% of the oxygen. So that oxygen is really important, because if you don't deliver enough oxygen, your brain doesn't function as well. So it's really, really important to make sure that as you get older, less activity can sometimes drive less oxygen to the brain, but keeping an active lifestyle can also increase that thing. So you might not need as much oxygen, because as you start to reduce your amount of activities, but you still need a good amount of it. And 25% is generally the rule of how much oxygen is needed from the brain that's delivered from the lungs on there. Now, Asians, part of the study that I think is really important is Asians tend to be affected by something called vascular dementia more frequently. And so this is usually, it's a very loose term at this point, because what we know is that there are complications in your blood that can cause defects or dysfunction in delivering oxygen to the brain. And in addition, you might also have some of these blood vessels start to leak, and they can be the large blood vessels. If they leak too much, they can cause a stroke, or small blood vessels, which cause that inflammation activity locally on there. So in my lab, we actually are looking at some of, in animal models, we're actually looking at some of these large blood vessel dilatations. This seems to affect some Asian populations. There are small areas in Japan that suffer greatly from a large blood vessel dilatation and vascular dementia. And then a majority suffer from small vessel dilatation. This is actually something that might be different between different ethnic populations. For Caucasians, they suffer from a lot of small blood vessel dilatations and rarely large blood vessels. In Asians, you suffer from both. In Hispanics, you tend to have a much larger large blood vessel dilatation. So while you hear the term vascular dementia, often what it means is dementia is just generally the memory loss aspect. The vascular is that they think that the blood component of it is what's driving some of this memory loss, whereas Alzheimer's disease is kind of a broader range of many things, including vascular dementia that might impact it. So what we want to do in our studies is actually try to figure out where that line is in terms of populations, things like that on there. So part of understanding these types of things is important. Right now, some of the diagnostic techniques aren't necessarily going to pick it up. So if you are suspected of having Alzheimer's disease, you would go in for your geriatrician might or family doctor might recommend getting a CAT scan or a CT scan, but some of these types of things will be more detectable in magnetic resonance imaging, that black and white image I showed you earlier on there. So it's always good to remember how some of the different techniques are good for identifying different disease parts of that. And then one thing that while we aren't doing MRI in our study, we do hope to include that in later form on that. So a lot of things can affect the blood system, not just in Asians, but all populations. This can include blood pressure and hypertension, stroke, and these are actually very common events that take place in older adults. And sometimes the strokes, not strokes, but kind of blood leakage, you never would even know that you've had it until you get an MRI or something like that. So like the white matter hyperintensity, that white area in that MRI came out only from the imaging, not necessarily from any other reason why. Some of the factors might include genetics. There are genetic predispositions for people to develop some of these large blood vessel changes. Your diet can really impact it. So we know that fatty foods might make a difference on this. So part of the things that we're going to be studying is how diet might impact your risk of Alzheimer's disease. And in particular, how the immigrant experience might change it. So while if you're in Asia, you might have more of a grain diet and more organic foods. In North America, depending on the populations and if you cook your food versus eat out a lot, you might have a lot more processed food. So we want to kind of understand that. Some of the changes in exercise and activity can, impact how your blood works. As I mentioned before, diabetes is also an important risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and for cardiovascular blood diseases, as well as cholesterol. And cholesterol is kind of related to a lot of these types of things, but there are good cholesterols and bad cholesterols, and those bad cholesterols are one of the effects that we end up having that can impact your risk of development or lowering your brain health on that. So as I mentioned, this magnetic resonance imaging can kind of show you what a brain looks like. As I mentioned earlier before, you have these white matter hyperintensities. So while these two brains are fairly similar in terms of their structure, in terms of all the different parts of the brain, they're fairly even. What you see here are these areas that are kind of white, and this is actually in the white matter, which is kind of how the brain connects from the parts that think or do actions to things like your spinal cord and your organs in your body. So what's happening here is you probably have some inflammation that's going on, and this is going to cause some deficits in this area, and then you're going to also start to kind of get some brain cell loss in that region here. So this is important also because this is actually coming off of this area called the ventricles. And the ventricles are a good way of flushing out all the things that kind of go bad in your brain. So it's really meant to kind of be a reservoir of liquid, and then it basically gets secreted into your blood system on there. So what we can do with magnetic resonance imaging is quite good, but as people know in the Ontario and Canadian healthcare system, we don't necessarily have the MRI ability to get everyone to do an MRI. So we are starting to kind of move away from this high level technology for diagnosis to potentially looking at blood biomarkers, which are coming out as pretty strong on that. Or, the other option was for diagnostics, they might do an imaging like MRI, or doing a cerebrospinal fluid lumbar puncture, which most people are not very fond of, and tend to be less used in Canada. So I mentioned diabetes quickly in the cardiovascular one. This is actually a really important factor in terms of Alzheimer's disease. In fact, Alzheimer's disease has been coined type 3 diabetes. So type 1 is when you don't have pancreas. Type 2 is when you have glucose or insulin resistancy on here. And so this is the inability to process sugar on that. The type 3 being Alzheimer's disease might be that in the brain, you don't use sugar the way you should. And sugar is actually really important. Similar to oxygen, you need a lot of sugar to have your brain function. In fact, it needs about 20% of all the sugar that's produced to function properly on that. When you lower that sugar utilization, you can also lower function of the brain. And so that kind of creates this whole energy loss event on there. In addition, diabetes can cause obesity. So just generally, it causes a more or less active lifestyle on there, and can impact how your brain functions, and thinking about memory and things like that can hurt that. So diabetes is both related to diet. So an unhealthy or less healthy diet can increase your risk of diabetes. And then there's also a genetic component that's associated with this. Up to about 60% of people in Asia these days also are experiencing a diabetic situation. We're kind of investigating whether that's actually a difference in terms of the blood biomarker baselines or an actual physiological effect. And one of the things that's important to really kind of note is that while a lot of the research, there's been a lot of research on brain function, diabetes, and things like that, often it's been in Europe or North American populations, which tend to be Caucasian dominated. So that doesn't reflect a population biology, it reflects a certain cohort biology. So we want to kind of expand that to kind of either prove it or provide a nuance as to why this might not always be the case on there. So this is kind of like not necessarily going to be what we do in terms of research other than being a risk factor, but there is also some importance in kind of identifying how diabetes might impact people of Asian descent or people of Caucasian descent. So comparing likes as well as potential differences there. So there's quite a few ways. I think this audience probably knows, keeping your brain healthy is as important as keeping your body healthy. And often they go hand in hand. So things like exercise are really important. So just even simple walking, Tai Chi. Mabel is very familiar with table tennis, since Yihong has launched a study on how this might improve, health of individuals as well as learning and memory. Mental health exercises keep that brain sharp. Keeping your activity going is really important, because one of the things you have to remember is, when we start to get into the retirement age, our activities change significantly. So you go from having a 9-to-5 job, or in some cases a 7-to-7, a 5 or 6 day a week job, to not doing as much. And sometimes that change in activity can really kind of change in terms of your system. So maintaining a healthy exercise activity, both physical and mental health exercises, can be quite important on this. During COVID, I think we've also learned that social interactions are really important, whether it's Zoom or in-person activities. These are really important for kind of lessening the stress of not being able to touch or hug a loved one, but also just kind of keeping those social interactions. What humans might be a little bit different from some of the lower animals is that we tend to, want interactions with other individuals, and this stimulation is important for the brain. Reducing stress is actually part of all these different things. physical, mental health exercises, social interactions can often reduce stress. So something like an exercise like Tai Chi tends to lower the cortisol levels that are one of the blood biomarkers of stress. And it's also a physical exercise that one can do generally. And then finally, I think with a lot of the discussion with pandemic is how depression might play a role in dementia. So we know that up to 40%, we're not totally sure on those figures because there's still a lot of commingling of the disease kind of diagnosis. So we don't always detect both at the same time. Often people will say you're either depressed or you have dementia, but taking a deeper dive, and this is something where my institute, CAMH, is involved as a leader in this research, is to kind of think about how depression and dementia kind of go together sometimes on this. And the impact of COVID has kind of exacerbated some of those types of changes individuals. So being aware of depression, I think is one of the first things to kind of recognize, and seeking support as you can on this is, I think, critical for ensuring a healthy brain function on that, and also reducing your risk of dementia. So one of the other things that my lab is looking at is how sleep might be important in kind of keeping your brain healthy on that. There are two parts in terms of sleep that are really important for this. So there are 4 cycles in sleep. You have something where you're awake. So this is when you're slightly moving and things like that. And then you have something called REM. This is rapid eye movement. People are probably familiar, you'll have dreams or nightmares during this stage. And in this stage, you tend not to move, but your brain activity and your eye activity is quite active on there. Then you have a light sleep. And the light sleep is not necessarily a big thing, but it actually can represent a bigger part of your sleep as you get older, or the awake cycle. And then deep sleep. So deep sleep is actually when your brain just basically starts to shut down. And that's actually a critical thing, because what it is basically relaxing and helping your brain rebuild. So why I point out these cycles is REM is critical for your memory. So I identified an area that was involved in learning and memory. So REM, rapid eye movement, is involved in how that memories consolidate. So brain cells, it's a little bit difficult to explain, but in a nutshell, brain cells can kind of have connections with other brain cells through electrical signaling. And what happens there is they form memories in something called an engram. And these memories start to form as you build up. And REM is really important for that, because what it does is take those lived experiences and then encodes them into your brain cells so that you have these memories. And as we get older, and definitely during people with dementia, like Parkinson's disease, your REM begins to decline. And so your learning and memory aspect of sleep start to decline. And then the other part is deep sleep. So deep sleep, I said, was part of that, that resting stage where your brain starts to heal itself on there. So during the daytime, you build up all these different types of material in your brain cells. Think about cells as kind of being having a recycling center. So during the daytime, you build up all this garbage, and then at nighttime, the recycling takes place. And that deep sleep part is actually where the brain flushes out all the stuff into the blood. And if you don't have enough deep sleep, you don't have that opportunity to unwind. So it's kind of like you build up the garbage in front of your house because you haven't had time to have the garbage removal take place away from your house, your brain in this case. So this is actually something that's really important to kind of think about. Sleep apnea, while it hasn't been shown as a specific risk, might impact disease. And so what we want to do is kind of look at how maybe low oxygen levels might, or the lack of REM and deep sleep during sleep apnea might be impacted on this. So this is something our lab is looking at in animal models of Alzheimer's disease. Let's see. So I'm getting a little bit slow on this, so I'm going to kind of quickly go through, and I will say maybe I'll skip some of the parts, and if people are interested on expanding it, and of course if the co-hosts want me back, I'm happy to talk about more of these types of things in detail on this. So one of the things that I actually did in my early days of research when I was in graduate school is thinking about genetics and pharmacology in Asian populations. So we know a couple of events. So here is an example of the same individual without and with alcohol. And you can see, and some people might also experience this, is you get a flushing experience. So your face turns red. And that's usually a kind of something like an allergic reaction. What's happening here is your body converts the alcohol into something called an aldehyde. And in Asians, you tend to be quite deficient on this. But this aldehyde can be a toxic substance in your blood. And so it causes basically an inflammatory response on this, and this includes some of that flushing activity here. So in some Asians, you lack the enzyme to convert this aldehyde into a less toxic substance. And so for a little bit, while it's trying to play catch up, you're going to be quite red in the face and on the skin. We know that there's a higher risk if you have this enzyme change to increase your risk of stomach cancer. And there's more increasing evidence that it might also impact your risk of Alzheimer's disease. So I'm just going to skip this. And then other enzymes that might be involved, actually thinking about, how we convert drugs. So for example, we have it, as part of your energy dynamic, your mitochondria this is kind of considered the nuclear power plant of your cells. They also contain enzymes that convert, that break down some drugs and proteins, and other chemicals. And donzapil is actually one that's broken down by an enzyme that's slightly defective in some Asians. So it can actually lead to a toxic buildup of some of the medications on there. Similarly, another enzyme in the mitochondria called Plavix was shown to also not be broken down in Asians, and it actually had increased side effects and caused toxicity and lethality in a population. So Plavix had to kind of modify how they get prescribed, especially in Asian populations. So kind of being aware of some of your enzymes is critical on this. So a lot of the research that I've done is kind of focused on Alzheimer's disease. And as I've alluded to, there's generally memory loss and other brain functions that kind of slow down during during Alzheimer's disease. And it's about 60 to 80% of all dementias are Alzheimer's disease. So there's a cardiovascular, a vascular dementia. There's also something called frontal temporal dementia, but Alzheimer's disease is the majority here. And you can see, actually, this is the brain of two people who passed away. This person had no memory issues and looks to be having had a healthy brain. And this person had Alzheimer's disease for about 7 years. And you can see some of these cracks in the brain. This is basically folds where all the brain cells are. And the largest area that seemed to be impacted is right around the middle area here. This is that temporal cortex I mentioned. And you can see that there's been a lot of brain cell loss on there. When you took a look at the brains themselves, this was a drawing that was made by a man called Dr. Alzheimer. He was the one who characterized the disease back in 1905, published this work a few years later. And these are actually something called plaques, and these are called tangles. These are modern day pictures of what they look. So his drawings are pretty good compared to actually what they look like as a real image on there. So these are the two proteins that are built up when you have Alzheimer's disease. And so this is classically different from aging. So while you get a little bit of this during aging, you have a lot of these plaques and tangles and cell loss when you have Alzheimer's disease. So early on, the signs and symptoms are, it's a mild memory loss. So it's not that different from forgetting little things, but it does progress. So you lose the ability to speak or have conversations or kind of respond to your environment. Normally it's about 4 to 8 years. But I think what's important during this stage is ensuring quality of life and ensuring that at least if we can try to treat early on or detect earlier on, these stages will be lessened in terms of the severity on that. Of the top 10 diseases, it's the only one that doesn't have a cure. It's currently the 8th leading cause of death in Canada, and I believe the 5th leading cause of death in the United States. So this leads me to our study, and this is called ACAD. So it's called the Asian Cohort for Alzheimer's disease. It is currently and will be increasingly the largest study of Alzheimer's disease in Chinese and other East Asian populations in the United States and Canada. I will preface that in Toronto, we are recruiting people of Chinese descent, but we do hope to expand that to other populations. And with the ACAD itself, it is going to be site-specific whose populations will be recruited for our study. So why ACAD? Well, it's the fastest growing demographic population in the United States and Canada. In the US, within a generation, it's expected to pass the African-American population in terms of total percentage in the United States. So we're going from anywhere from 6.5% probably up to 13 or 14% in about 20 to 30 years. In the last 5 years, there's been about a 20 to 25% increase on that. And that covers not just East Asians, but also South Asians, or generally anyone of Asian population. They tend to be vastly underrepresented in Alzheimer's disease studies. So the most recently approved, FDA approved in the US drug Aduhelm or aducanumab had very few Asians. I think it was only 3 Asians tested in North America, even though the population is about 6%, and the study had about 5,000 people. So 3 is not a lot in terms of percentage. They had 3% in population in all the trials, and they were all from Japan. So we were thinking about not necessarily reflecting a global population when we only kind of think about doing Europe, US, and Japan on that. And we know that non-genetic risk factors, so we're going to look at genetic risk factors and non-genetic risk factors and how they might play a role in disease or how they might combine to play a role in disease. Because we know that lived experiences are critical in understanding how Alzheimer's disease might develop. One thing that I've kind of struggled with all my life is how Asians are kind of considered the model minority. And over time, it's learned to be a pejorative term because while demographically we might look like we have higher education or things, the health access is not even across populations. So it can impact older populations and it can impact health literacy because people forget that this population might not have the same advantages on that. And so one of the things that I've kind of always felt is that I've had advantages in my life. And one thing I do want to do is make sure that everyone has those advantages in their life and kind of creating that environment of learning, of education, of dissemination, identifying resources, I think is really critical. And I applaud the work of our hosts here who do this in real time in the community every day. So increasing health literacy and reducing that stigma of dementia are really critical. Growing up, it wasn't unheard of that if someone had Alzheimer's disease in the family, only their family would know. And that often created a big deficit in how one can function, the mental stress of that. And knowing that there are resources out there, I think is really important through the social services, through Momiji, through Yihong, these are really important to kind of develop and utilize on that. And spreading that word, I think, is really important on that. In addition, one of the things we would like to do is kind of expand some of the critical care and diagnostics on that, working with some of the hospitals to ensure a faster flow of information and treatment, or sorry, not treatment, diagnosis. So ACAD is not just in the Toronto site. It's actually now grown to be 10 recruiting sites across North America. These represent the largest Asian populations in East Asian populations in North America right now. We're hoping to recruit up to about 5,000 people of Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese descent. The people from Korean descent will largely come from the New Jersey area. The people of Vietnamese descent will come from the Orange County area in California. We do hope to grow these populations. Right now, the critical shortcoming is bandwidth to be able to do assessments in every language on that. So we've kind of focused on Chinese because at least in Toronto, it is the largest population, but we do hope to kind of make this even more inclusive over time. So this actually is a study that's going to take place, is taking place right now, and we are going into a new funding round through the U.S. government. The National Institutes of Health is a U.S. government funded agency, similar to some of the ones in Canada, but they have a bit more funding for this type of work, and they are interested in kind of representing different organizations around the world to ensure there's diversity and ethnic parity for some of these health-related issues. So in addition to the Toronto recruiting site, I'm also intimately involved as director of the Be Heard, which is really a education and outreach organization where we want to kind of increase information about Alzheimer's disease, create awareness about resources and understanding about what the disease process is. We work with all the other groups on this, but I'm also involved with the biosample core. And the biosample core or biomarker core is we're going to be collecting blood and other data to try to identify if people who during some of the assessments, like memory test assessments, have Alzheimer's disease, and if we can detect it in the blood. So as I said, MRI and lumbar punctures are really how people are detecting Alzheimer's in the US, but that technology is less accessible in many places and costs a lot. So if you can get a blood test in the same way a doctor might say, you're at risk for high blood pressure, let's give you some medication for this. This will actually be a game changer if we can start to think about blood as a diagnostic tool. So this is part of our study right now, is to collect blood and see if we can predict Alzheimer's disease from the blood that matches up with a memory test. And this leads to a project where we're going to look at some of the genes that are involved that increase your risk of Alzheimer's disease, as well as some of the non-genetic factors, those lived experiences and the blood events on there. So, and as I mentioned, 40%, these lived events, about 40% of these could potentially be modifiable. So if we identify that diet or exercise or alcohol are important on this, it will probably come out in our study on this. And we're also working with groups in Asia and other populations to kind of do that comparison between different ethnic groups like African American and Hispanic. So in Toronto, we have a fairly large population, up to about 130,000 people over the age of 60. And this is actually all Asian populations. So we have a fairly good population base to kind of recruit. And our goal is about 200 people per year, 1/3 of those with Alzheimer's, 2/3 with healthy controls. Since there is no kind of Alzheimer's cohort of Asian descent, part of our goal is to kind of increase our efforts through the community, like Yihong. And this is the heat map of where we're kind of doing a lot of our work. People are quite familiar. This is Scarborough-Markham area where a lot of the people of Asian descent are. The original Chinatowns, both in the downtown core and the east, in the Riverdale area, and then also a population in Mississauga. We're also kind of keeping an eye on potentially including South Asians in our population studies. And again, in Scarborough, there's a large population, as well as Mississauga and Brampton on this. And our goal is to increase the inclusivity of populations. And that's something that we hope to expand in future directions on that. This is the team that I work with. They're great. I'm going to add in that in addition to Michelle, we have a new person joining us as an intern, Helen Lee, who's actually on this call also. Jake and Eleanor are both research analysts who do the testing instruments on that. And I sign the papers and kind of let them go because they're doing a great job. So as I mentioned, this is part of some of the volunteer work and the pre-screening that we do, some of the things that we test. As may have been mentioned, all these slides will be available, so I'll just skip this in terms of the pre-screening unless people have questions. Some of the things I think that we, have gotten back from the community are, having that inclusion, being part of the representation in knowing some of the what Alzheimer's disease is, having more knowledge about Alzheimer's disease and potentially ethnic differences, and thinking about how this might impact their children or their community are really important as to what kind of motivates some people. Some of the concerns are the stigma. In Chinese, the literal term is not necessarily friendly, so we do want to change that kind of thing. Understanding that there are access to resources, I think, is really critical. Making sure that people understand that they're not losing their rights or freedom with dementia, but they're actually getting care to address some of that loss of autonomy that they might have in terms of the quality of life on that. Some people are worried about being a burden on their family, and I think kind of enhancing the resources that are available really is important on understanding. And then finally, whether some of the procedures are invasive, we found that people are very willing to give blood. And blood really, I think, is the wave of the future in terms of being able to diagnose a disease. So the same way that you can diagnose diabetes or high blood pressure, or high cholesterol levels, this is a way we want to kind of help move the future on this. And so when we talk to people, I think a lot of people understand it, and hopefully we can get the community involved in some of that dialogue. And then finally, actually, I'm going to skip that. So this is our study. This is actually the end of the talk. If anyone is interested, they can go to acadstudy.org, which is the North America-wide site on the work. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at acadstudy@chemh.ca or through Mabel or others. I'm happy to answer questions. What I do want to say is that, we don't necessarily, this is not just a one seminar and bye. It really is a one seminar to begin with and hello more than anything else, because we do want to work together with the community. And so having the bridge in terms of if there's scientific or medical information that's needed, we're happy to help out in that. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Amazing presentation. So we will go ahead and take some time for question now. So if you wanted to ask question, please raise your hand and I will call on you to ask.
Please look at the chat. We have